arcane journal for Warhammer the Old World is due for release imminently, but it occurred to me that I have been remiss and I have not thus far reviewed the Empire Arcane Journal. Let's rectify that now. It's time for one of my incredibly scientific reviews, utilising the technology of the whiteboard, in which I break down each edition of the Empire Army book, comparing the units that were available at the time, the background material that's presented, the magic items, spells and special rules that are presented, and the unique wildcard category, which for this edition, this review, is the Sigmar's Hammer review. Yes, we're going to go into a bit more detail about what that entails a little bit later. But first, which editions then am I reviewing? Well, whilst many other fine editions are available, I am going to be constraining myself to, as I have done in the previous reviews of this ilk, the 4th/5th edition army book for the Empire, the 6th/ going into 7th edition of the army book of the Empire, and the Old World Army Book, or Flavour Pamphlet Arcane Journal. This will also include the Empire forces that featured in Forces of Fantasy for the Old World, and I will be generous and throw in anything that appeared in kind of the Warhammer Chronicles publications, the kind of extra editions, the General's Compendium stuff that appeared during 6th edition to flesh out the Empire Army. That's essentially all the White Dwarf articles and kind of the best of the pieces that were featured in the Citadel Journal at that era. But without further ado then, let's dive right in and determine once and for all which is the best edition of the Empire Army book. Turning firstly then to the 4th/5th edition version of the army book, I would say that this is kind of the definitive army book, at least for the era that it was published. It contained a real kind of wealth of information. A lot of the information that we now know about the Old World originated in the Empire Army book. A lot of the material that had featured in the various Warhammer Fantasy roleplay books was kind of compiled to make a comprehensive history of Sigmar's Empire. What units, though, is the first category. What units were available in this version of the army book? Well, quite a lot is the answer. Compared to some of the other army books that were out at the time, there is a wealth of different unit options that were available. I think it's got some of the widest selection of regiments available to it at that time. But were they any good, and how are they presented? Well, the units that are presented, in terms of characters, it's fairly generic, as it was at that time. You've got an Empire General, Empire Heroes, and you've got Wizards. It doesn't really flesh it out much more than that. You do, however, have pretty much everything that we've now got in the Empire range in terms of core units. So halberdiers, swordsmen, spearmen, archers, various flavours of knights, Knights of the White Wolf, Knights of the Blazing Sun, Knights Panther, Reiksguard Knights. You had Reiksguard Knights on foot, which were pretty darn awesome at that point in time, packing as they were full plate armour, which gave them a 4-up save on foot before you added in the shield that they were holding as well. That you got ogres, you got dwarves, you got halflings, you got all of the different manifold races that made up the Empire of Sigmar represented in this book. You got a whole host of different war machines, including one of my all-time favourites, the Halfling Hot Pot, which essentially worked on the principle of a halfling chef flinging a cookpot full of chili at the opponents, complete with cauldron and all. There is a wide selection of special characters, probably the widest selection of special characters I think that's been produced at any point for the Empire. But you also got the units from Kislev. So you got the Tsarina, you got the Griffin Legion, you got the Kislev Horse Archers. You got, in short, a lot of stuff in this edition. And that's the reason why, when it comes to scoring, I am going to give this an 8 out of 10. Very bad 8. Let's try that again. Now it's gone really smudgy. Okay, excuse it being smudgy. I'm going to try that again. Why an 8 out of 10? Well, the only reason I'm going 8 and not higher is in terms of the quality of the units that were presented here. They were all somewhat samey. A spearman was very similar in stats to a halberdier. Really, they could have been represented by a single unit entry with just the option to vary their war gear. Likewise, great swords were not the hard-hitting powerhouses that we know them as today. Instead, they were actually worse swordsmen than the swordsman entry, which is somewhat ironic. I would have given this a slightly higher score, I think, were it not for that generic nature. I mean, in terms of even down to the dwarves and so forth that you can feature in your list here, they are just the generic dwarven warriors. There's no real uniqueness to them, and that's a little bit sad. But nonetheless, an excellent book. Let's move on to the 6th edition book. 6th edition. Now, obviously, this was a major change to the way in which armies were presented. We got things shuttled into their various categories, special, core, rare, which we still see in the old world today. This was kind of an evolution of the same way in which fast attack and heavy support and troops and so forth had been broken up in 40k around that time. In terms of units that are available, we see a real drop-off here compared to what was available in the 4th and 5th edition. State troops have essentially been boiled down to humans with various sharp bits of metal and sticks. Likewise, missile troops are, you got guns, you got crossbows. Units that had been present in the 4th/5th edition book, like Outriders and even the Steam Tank, had all disappeared. Likewise, all of the various kind of different species that were present during the Empire, the dwarves, the halflings, the ogres, are completely absent from this list. Also, the amount of different war machines that were available was massively toned down. There was, at this point the book was released, there was no steam tank, there was no war wagon, there was no halfling hotpot, tragically. Knights, equally, were boiled down to being just essentially either knights with lances or knights with hammers. There was none of the different flavours of knight that you had in the earlier edition. So for this reason, I'm going to mark it down as a 7. Again, this actually would have been lower if it weren't for what the Citadel Journal and the White Dwarf articles cranked out. We did eventually get rules for the Steam Tank. That was published in a compendium. Equally, we got rules for different knightly orders featuring in the Citadel Journal. And you could, I suppose, dogs of war in halflings, like lumping troops, halfling archers, if you really wanted to try and represent what was present in your earlier army. But it was very much a case of trying to bend things to fit, rather than it being an instant fit out of the box. I mean, I'm talking myself, I'm tempted to mark it down even further, but I'm going to leave it at 7. I'm going to leave it at 7 because of what was brought in terms of things like the Kislev supplement and all the other little add-ons that helped make the Empire, as they were presented in 6th, better than they were perhaps when they first appeared. The Old World then, well, the Old World, we have basically everything that's been in the earlier editions. So all the stuff that had kind of gone missing from 5th edition, when we got 6th, so the Outriders, the War Wagon, have all made a glorious return in the Old World. But not only that, we've got additional stuff that's been added in as well. I think we obviously got the stuff that had been added in at the end of 8th, things like the Griff Charge Riders, we got things like the Hellstorm, we got things like the Hellstorm Rocket Battery. So all those additional bits that had been added are still present in this version of it, but we got additional stuff as well. We've got Road Wardens, which I think is pretty cool. We've got a Flagellant character option, which I think is really cool. We've got Witch Hunters as a separate choice. We've got all manner of different kind of options. The only thing, in fact, that is missing from the Old World version of the Empire is the Halflings and the Halfling Hotpot. And it's for that reason that they get a 9 and not a 10 for the various units that are available. Is that a 9 the right way up? Yeah, it is. Okay. Can't tell from upside down. Let's move on to the background as it was presented. As I've said, the 4th, 5th edition book contains most of the stuff that we know about Sigmar's Empire today. It contains all of the stuff that was kind of gathered from the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay supplements and a little bit extra as well. And it contains a stonking story written from the point of view of Gotrek and Felix, those two ne'er-do-wells, as they witness a battle with the Emperor Karl Franz himself on his griffin, Deathclaw, battling against an orcish horde. It is almost, I mean, well over half the book, I think, is made up of background in one way, shape or form. There are awesome kind of excerpts in the colour section telling you things about, like, the background of the steam tank, the background of the halfling hotpot. There's tactical articles in here. If you want to know about the Empire, then I think this is probably an excellent book to pick up, even if you don't want to play the earlier editions of the game. For that reason, again, I'm going to give that I'm going to give that a 9, because it is a really good book from that point of view. 6th edition suffers in this regard, because 6th edition, they stripped a lot of that background information out. They did pump some of it into kind of the bestiary section, where they were giving information about the different units, but it loses a lot of the flavour and character that was present in the earlier army book. Most of the background material is in fact confined to a small section near the back, which features some stories and some nice, almost like excerpts from illuminated manuscripts of the time, but it does suffer in that regard, and that's why it's clocking in with another 7. The Arcane Journal then, how does that fare? I was pleasantly surprised on this, because I was particularly interested in this to hear what the background about the state of Sigmar's empire at this point was going to be. What was the state of kind of the Empire of Man during this era, where we're coming to the end of kind of the time of the 3 emperors? How is that going to be presented? And I think this is actually one of the thicker Arcane Journals that they've been presenting. It comes with a host of information, kind of briefly about essentially, and here's what's happened in the last 1,000 years. Quick scroll across the screen as we cover basically everything that's happened since the time of Boris Goldgather and Mandred Skaven Slayer. And then we cover nicely kind of up to, here we are, what's going on now. Here's the state of play. Here is the major players in the Empire at the time. Here is a nice little colour section just detailing some of the uniforms of the era, which was a pleasant surprise. And then we dive into the narrative kind of scenario section, which is interesting here that it's Beastmen that are the adversary of this. Whereas previous ones it's been Chaos or Bretonnians have fought the forces of Khemri. It's Beastmen, and I'm told that the High Elf one is going to be Beastmen as well, which does suggest that Beastmen are going to play a fairly major role in kind of the narrative arc of this era. I think that's really cool, not just because I'm starting a Beastmen army, but in terms of what this fleshes you out then in terms of the information about the era, I am very, very happy with it. I don't think it goes quite as high as what was presented in the 4th edition book, but it has less pages to do so. But in terms of the narratively themed army lists that are presented, the special characters that feature in here, it definitely earns itself an 8, even if it doesn't quite rise as high as the 9 that the 4th and 5th edition book garnered. Let's talk about magic items, spells, and special rules then now. So, 4th, 5th edition had the benefit that it had the Warhammer Magic book, which gave access to a wide range of generic and kind of common magic items. It also carried with it a old host of kind of special Empire-specific magic items, things like the Rune Fang, things like the Mace of Hellstrom, weapons like Galmaraz itself, the great Sigmarite Warhammer that was wielded by the Emperor Karl Franz. All of these things kind of feature in there, and there is a nice little element, again, in the Warhammer Magic book that you get access to the colleges of magic, the kind of 8 laws of magic that were codified by Teclis at the end of kind of the Old World era, when he founded the colleges of magic following the Great War against Chaos. In terms of special rules, though, the Empire was somewhat lacking in this regard at this point, whereas later editions, as we'll talk in a minute, got a whole host of special rules to represent the kind of the drilled and regimented abilities of the Empire. At this point, they did have a rule called the Detachment Rule, but all it gave was a very minor buff to leadership abilities, and it essentially just allowed you to share the leadership of a parent unit, which perhaps has a special character in it or something with a high leadership, with smaller units that are attached alongside. Beyond that, it really didn't have much else to distinguish it from just a straight out of the book, generic historical army, compared to perhaps some of the other armies out there like the Skaven or the Undead at that time that had a real range of different stuff. It's for that reason that I'm only going to give the 4th, 5th edition a 7. I was tempted to give it an 8, but I think it's that lack of army-wide special rules that drops it down 1 point there. 6th edition changed all that. 6th edition gave us what we now know as the detachment rule. And in fact, this is something in the old world that has been made available to other armies, but at that point in time was specifically an Empire-only special rule. What that did was it gave you the ability for essentially a group of units to act as a single unit. So it allowed, if a parent unit were to be charged, it allowed its kind of detached units to carry out charge reactions. And those charge reactions might be things like stand and shoot if they were a missile unit, like handgunners. But equally, it could be allow them to do things like countercharge and flank a unit that was charging the parent unit. Likewise, the parent unit could protect its kind of child units should it wish to do so. It really changed the way in which Empire played. the magic items as well. There was a real kind of range of magic items that were presented in the book. There was a whole kind of 3-page, 4-page spread of the treasure vaults under the Imperial Palace. And we got some of the weapons that even today are still making an appearance in the old world, first made their appearance in the pages of the 6th edition army book. The spell laws, it lacked a unique spell law that the other armies got. It didn't have things like the dark magic spells that Dark Elves got, or the necromantic spells that Undead got. You just got access to the 8 laws of magic that were published in the 6th edition core book. But I think that's okay. It's for that reason that I'm going to give the 6th edition book a 9. Because I think it genuinely really brought a whole depth of kind of variety to an Empire army that was one of the things it had been lacking until now. Where do we stand then with the old world? Well, I was really hopeful that we would get something akin to kind of the dramatic changes that the Dwarf book brought. I mean, the Dwarf book gave us things like runes for missile weapons, and it gave us, runic tattoos for slayers. It really kind of pushed the boat out. The Empire book falls down somewhat in that regard, and I think the major reason for that is that the majority of the magic items that are presented in the back here, A, don't really add anything different to the army from what was kind of presented in the magic items that featured in Forces of Fantasy, but also the majority of them are locked to one of the 2 narrative armies that feature in this book. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but I think perhaps having 1 or 2 magic items locked to those narrative lists is characterful and encourages the use of those characterful lists. Having almost all of them locked to it, it brings the army as a whole down. They still have the detachment rule, which, as I mentioned, has now become a universal special rule that can be used by other armies across the range, albeit I think the High Elves is one of the only ones that can immediately spring to mind. I think the Dwarves have one option in that regard to just kind of back up Iron Breakers with Iron Drakes. But in any event, the Empire get a much wider spread of availability in that regard. Beyond that, though, they really don't have much that distinguishes them. They don't get a unique spell law, unlike other armies. They don't get, unique prayers or anything really of that nature that would make them jump off the page. It's for that reason that I'm going to give them an 8 rather than a 9. They're not as low as a 7 because they do still have something that makes them stand out compared to other armies. But, yeah, I do feel there's something a little bit lacklustre there. A missed opportunity, perhaps. Let's go into the final round then, the Sigmar round! Okay, so what is the wild card here? Well, previously I've compared armies to things like the 1999 film The Mummy. I have compared the size of beards that perhaps the dwarves present. I did consider mustaches for this one, but that's a little bit too close to the dwarven beards. What I have instead decided to rank each edition on is the scale of hammer, because it seems only appropriate for an army founded around Sigmar and his mighty hammer that we compare these in the same vein. Let's start with the 4th and 5th edition. How much does it echo the vision of Sigmar? The idea of a united collection of tribes and city-states forming together to create something greater than itself. I think it really does achieve that. I mean, in that regard, it has, like I said, all the different kind of species brought under one roof. It even has Kislev, its long-term ally, rolled in under that kind of umbrella as well. For that reason, I'm going to compare it to perhaps one of the mightiest hammers to feature in fiction. That is Mjolnir, the hammer of Thor. What that translates into in terms of scoring, I'm going to give them, I'm going to give them a 9. I think that is a full-on 9 out of 10 when it comes to that. The 6th edition book, how does that compare? Well, as I mentioned, it does unfortunately lack some of the variety that was present in the earlier edition. It does have, a collection of city-states, but it really does. You could represent a single section of the Empire with the 6th edition book, and it would stand out well in that regard. There are obviously the variety of lists that feature in the back of the book that perhaps, give you some extra flavour. The special lists, I suppose, is how I think of them. Things like the Knightly list and the Cult of Sigmar list and so forth. And there was the Ulrich list that was produced in kind of Storm of Chaos that introduced the Teutogan Guard for the first time. So that does add some aspect of it, perhaps, but it really doesn't necessarily represent that unifying force that Sigmar envisioned when we're talking about Empire armies. It does make them the generic, the bland, the Ultramarines of Warhammer 6th edition. And it's for that reason that I am instead referring them to a slightly different, perhaps cartoon hammer, and that is Fix-It Felix's hammer from the movie Wreck-It Ralph. How does that translate in terms of scoring? It's another 7 for the 6th edition book. Where does the old world come in on this then? Well, as I mentioned, it really does present an interesting cross-section of Sigmar's empire. It's interesting insofar as for a period in time in which the empire narratively is divided, it is actually the very antithesis of Sigmar's vision of humanity and all the other races of the land coming together in a unified force. What is interesting is that despite the fact that the higher-ups and the lords may well be feuding among themselves over who rules this land and who might eventually sit on the throne in Artdorf as a single unifying emperor, the individual armies, it would seem, don't reflect that. They are still made up of a variety of different things, ogres and dwarves and warriors from different city-states and even from opposite sides banding together against common foes. It does, I would suggest, perhaps the closest replica to what was supposed to be Sigmar's vision, if only it weren't for the halflings being missing. But to be fair, they weren't around during Sigmar's time, so we'll give them a break in that regard. For that reason, I think the only hammer that I can link this to is the mighty Galmaraz itself, which I am therefore going to give it a 10, and the only 10 that comes in my scoring for this edition. Now comes the point that's always quite funny, where I try and do maths. How does this work out? Okay, so how do 4th and 5th edition crock out? Well, 9 plus 9 is 18, 18 plus 7 is 25, 25 plus 8 is 33 out of a possible 40 for the 5th edition. Let's see how 6th edition make out. Well, 3 lots of 7s, that's 21, and a 9, that's a 30. Not bad, not bad. 75% of possible scores. I think you can see how this is going, though. 2 8s makes for 16, plus a 9 is 25. Add the 10, clocks in the old world at a mighty 35 out of a possible 40. Yeah, I think it's no surprise. I would say that the Empire army, as it is presented in the old world right now, is probably the best version of the Empire that we have seen on the tabletop to date, both in terms of the characterfulness of the army, the way in which the book is presented, and the way in which the army performs as a whole, representing what it is to be the Empire of Man in Warhammer the Old World. On that bombshell, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't already subscribed, please do me a favour, click that subscribe button, click the bell, turn on notifications, do all that stuff. It does make a difference. It does help me make sure that you don't miss something in the future. As you might imagine, I will be back relatively soon with the High Elf Arcane Journal, just as soon as I can get my grubby little mitts on a copy. And in the meantime, I've got some more content coming down the pipeline, and you can always catch me on the Warhammer podcast every fortnight. If you're not already a subscriber there, go over there. Yeah, please, find me on Blue Sky, find me on Instagram, and come over and join us on the Discord. All right, thanks for watching. Bye for now.